All right. Welcome back to the High Existence Podcast. I am Mike Slavin, and today I am being joined by Ed Prideaux. Ed is representing the Perception Restoration Foundation, a nonprofit that is focusing on helping people navigate through the symptoms they experience with HPPD, also known as hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. And I was very excited when Ed reached out to talk about this much under-discussed topic in the psychedelic space. So Ed, great to have you here today. Very excited for this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I'm glad you're as excited as I am.
Awesome. Well, I want to start out pretty broadly just to give people a primer who haven't, perhaps they haven't heard of HPPD, which can be kind of shocking to think, the amount of sort of media coverage on the positive benefits of psychedelics. There hasn't been as much attention on this phenomenon, I think, that there should be. So could you just give people a brief primer of what is HPPD for those who have never heard about it before?
Sure. Surprisingly complicated question, but I suppose the meat and potatoes of HPPD is that this is a particular after effect people report after taking lots of different kinds of drugs. That's what we're learning increasingly, but it seems especially psychedelics are prone to causing this after effect. And it's basically when you experience primarily visual changes after a drug experience. And there's a sort of stable list of perceptual changes that people experience. So you have something called visual snow, which is the appearance of your entire visual field being coated in almost like fine granular dots. And this is something that people might have reported who've never taken drugs. It might be a fairly normal visual phenomenon, but it seems people with HPPD experience this to a much more intense degree than most drug-free people report. And then you also have something called after images, which is something people might have experienced in psychedelics, which is when you look at an object, and then when you look away, a kind of bright silhouette of the object lingers elsewhere in your visual space. You have something called, when you got trails, you got traces, classic psychedelic effects. People might report geometric patterns, mandalas, kaleidoscopes. They might see melting walls, shifting text. They might see halos, which is when an object is essentially bordered by a bright, kind of almost literally angelic halo style thing. And for me, it's like a kind of bleach, bold white haloing. That whenever I see halos, that's what it's like. And with HPPD, it seems that they can be categorized into two basic kinds. The first type in the literature is called type 1 HPPD, which is when these perceptual changes come in episodic, kind of spontaneous flashback experiences, like the classic flashback we've been told about, where it seems that just for a defined, discrete period of time, you're thrown back into a kind of altered visual space. But type 2 HPPD, which seems like the far more common experience people with this with this condition, is when it's a more lingering, invested feature of your everyday perception. So it's not like you're just experiencing it episodically, like this is how you see now. And in order to kind of be categorized as HPPD, it has to kind of have a clear, maybe proximate causal link to the drug experience, and you really get into murky territory on kind of defining what exactly is and isn't HPPD, because as we'll discuss later in the podcast, it overlaps with other conditions that didn't necessarily involve drugs at all. But generally, it seems that for many people with kind of psychedelic induced HPPD, it's kind of in perhaps the day after, or maybe within a few days or within a week of a drug experience, they start noticing things. And HPPD can last a few weeks, a few months, can last years. I've experienced these perceptual changes for 6 years. You see people on forums who have had it for 40, 50 years, so the kind of old school trippers from the 70s and the 60s. And we kind of have no idea how common HPPD really is, because it's kind of an under-researched after effect of psychedelics. Psychedelics in general are very under-researched, but it seems like HPPD is particularly under-researched, and you can see that in the literature. There's a lot of confusion embedded within it. But there was a survey done about 10 years ago by a scientist who might be familiar to a lot of people kind of deeply involved in the psychedelic community, called Matthew Baggett. And together with Erowid, he did a survey of, I believe, about 2,500 psychedelic users, of whom I believe a quarter reported some kind of permanent perceptual alteration from a psychedelic. And then about 1 in 25 of the sample reported that this perceptual change, this lingering perceptual change, was so intense or so overwhelming that they considered seeking clinical help. So if we were to use the technical kind of DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual definition of HPPD, as opposed to the more general, commonplace definition of HPPD, which is just kind of perceptual changes in general. The DSM definition is, these are perceptual changes that are so distressing, they constitute a mental disorder. So it seems that it's very rough, but if as many as 1 in 25 really do experience kind of distressing perceptual change, I think it's concerning, and I think especially concerning given that it does seem to be so under-discussed. And kind of when I first sort of started coming out as someone who experiences HPPD and was seeking to motivate conversation around it, it was concerning, given these quite red flag raising statistics, that people weren't talking about it. And this is why I'm here today.
Thank you, Ed. That's an excellent primer. And I was going to ask why this is so important to you, but you've already led us there. It's because this is something that you experience yourself. I'm curious if you could give us a sense of, in the body subjective experience for you. What's it been like? Have you been experiencing it episodically, or is it more persistent? In what ways does it manifest? Are there certain things that make it more intense? If there are things going on in your life, is there a way that the symptoms respond to the circumstances? I'm curious from your sort of boots on the ground perspective, what your journey has been like from, first realizing, oh, wow, I have this, to where you are today.
Mm-hmm. So I got involved in psychedelics quite early in my life, probably an irresponsibly early age at 17. And it seems that there is a real correlation between people who experiment early, teenage years, and people who develop these perceptual changes, which implies kind of intuitively that this is something to do with that the developing brain effect has something of a correlation with this. But anyway, after my 4th trip on LSD, I noticed maybe a couple of days afterwards, I believe it was on the Monday following my Friday trip, when I was still in high school at this point, I noticed looking at the carpet that there were these sort of sparkly, almost star-like dots on the floor. And that's something that I would eventually learn is labeled the visual snow effect I described earlier. And then I started noticing things in class, like the walls were starting to melt. I started noticing kind of when it would be, I went to a Catholic school, which meant chapel every fortnight, and I'm going to chapel, and I noticed that, the walls in there would be starting to melt. There might be faint geometric patterns on the walls. And that's when I started really to be concerned that something had changed, because I didn't notice anything after my previous 3 trips that when it came anything close to this. And then I eventually stumbled across a Wikipedia page for HPPD, and I immediately recognized that, there's a GIF on the page which depicts visual snow, and I immediately recognized this is what I was experiencing. But in terms of my subjective experience day to day now, I mean, it waxes and wanes really. In the last couple of months, it's actually taken something of a dip in day to day, although it's still mostly noticeable in dark environments where my entire field of vision is just like kind of utterly coated by kind of bright, color-born visual snow. But if I'm tired, that's when it's actually pretty florid. So my vision might tend to sort of tunnel, where kind of on the borders around my visual field, on the kind of perimeter, it might be coated by a kind of black, kind of fuzz-like appearance. It might start to seize up as if it's sort of drowning in a bright, bleached white light after kind of the halo effect around every object I see. So fatigue is a huge kind of correlating factor with my experience of HPPD. Although I have had a couple of flashback style experiences, including one about 10 days ago, actually, when I was doing an acting course. And there was a particular moment during kind of this, strangely enough, during an improv session where I felt so, I guess I just felt I was so in tune with the moment in this improv session that I just kind of spontaneously had this weird flashback where, you know, green neon colors started setting in. I felt quite depersonalized. That's something I forgot to mention in my primer, as you put it, on HPPD, where it seems that quite a large proportion of people with HPPD experience also depersonalization and derealization, which is essentially a kind of dissociative response in which you feel kind of hyper disembodied, very, very disconnected from your immediate experience. And the derealization effect is when the entire world around you, it loses its intuitive sense of being real. And in that flashback kind of state on that acting course, that's precisely what it was. It was a kind of heavy dissociative response. But there have been times when the sort of type 2 lingering HPPD has really been very noticeable in everyday life. And that was especially in the year after it started coming on. I remember when I first went to university, which is quite a stressful change for a lot of people. And it seems that going to college is like a huge trigger for psychoses, because the sudden change, the sudden spike in novelty and new experiences and the pressure to make friends can set people off. But in my experience, it was honestly sometimes crazy what I would see. I would be in lectures, and I think that there's something of an intensifying effect with HPPD when you're in a kind of visual state where you're deeply focused on a particular point. And that's obviously what happens in lectures. You're looking at the presentation, looking at the lecturer in front. And there'll be moments when my entire field of vision would kind of deeply tunnel, where it was almost like there would be points when I was kind of half blind with kind of kaleidoscopic fuzzing effects. And I remember once kind of just thinking, if my friends to the left and right of me had any idea what I was saying right now, like their minds would be blown. Because that's another thing really to emphasize with HPPD is that, you know, even if it isn't too distressing or too panic inducing, I think that it's still pretty common for this experience, just by its very nature, to be very isolating, especially in our culture, which closes off and stigmatizes true openness around drugs. Because until this April, I had never told any of my family members that I had undergone I had HPPD at all. So it's almost like I was in a different world, you know, literally. You know, we'd be watching TV together, and whilst I was kind of basically tripping, although I don't want to indulge the narrative that HPPD is perma-tripping, but there are points when the presentation is kind of so florid that it is almost like you're in a psychedelic state. And then you're supposed to just have a normal conversation with your dad about what's on TV. So I think that, as I mentioned, the culture around drugs, it really closes off. The culture around drugs, it raises the distress that makes HPPD really matter, I guess is the point I'm making, especially given it affects teenagers so disproportionately.
Absolutely. Yeah, I imagine that can feel very isolating, to feel like you can't, express that or share that. And there's also this thing that I think is really beautiful, and it makes me excited and happy that you've decided to come forward. And I mean, not only in your own life, share it with people, but be more of a vocal sort of advocate for yourself and for others who are suffering with HPPD, because you were doing some searching around and you found a Wikipedia page, but there might be someone out there today who will encounter a podcast that you've done, and the level of that's so much more personal to hear that someone else is experiencing this. And there are people out there who might be really struggling and not know where to go or what to do. So giving them some resources to not feel so alone, I think is really important, and is a noble thing that you're doing. So I really want to sort of extend my thanks for your willingness to do that for others. And there's some other stuff that I'm really curious about. And I was going to ask you about if there was a correlation between younger individuals, because I noticed that Andrew Callahan was in the Perception Restoration Foundation video. And for those who don't know who he is, very popular YouTuber, formerly All Gas, No Breaks, now Channel 5 News. And he basically documents really sort of fantastical subcultures and just kind of gives them, a platform, and very, very often it can be quite hilarious. But he shares how he was doing, mushrooms at the age of 13 in a Vice interview, and that, created pretty serious HPPD symptoms. And it's great to see someone like him out there as well, who's being vocal about this, because I feel like he can probably reach a lot of people in the age group that might overdo it or might be experimenting in ways that they haven't been educated on this topic. There is this really interesting period that we're in right now where, psychedelics had always had this sort of countercultural cool to them. And now you have that sort of, you still have that intact while we're experiencing legalization and decriminalization in certain areas, as well as really robust science emerging in support of these things. And so there isn't as much conversation or discussion around what are the risks. Sure, these substances have real powerful possible therapeutic benefit in a lot of cases, but what are some of the downsides? Let's talk about that. We have to keep the conversation balanced. And so I'm very glad that we're creating a forum for that and discussing, some of these things, HPPD in particular. And I want to sort of veer the conversation in the direction of the work that you're doing at PRF, the Perception Restoration Foundation. What is sort of the game plan? How is it that this nonprofit is showing up to be an advocate for individuals who are suffering with HPPD? Where where is everyone going with that? How are you steering the ship?
Right. Awesome. Well, I'm glad you think it's a noble cause coming out with HPPD, because I mean, if this time last year, if I told myself that within a year I'd be publicly out and doing media appearances around HPPD, I would have, I just would have scarcely have believed you. But with the PRF, so I first hooked up with the PRF after I wrote an article for The Independent about HPPD, The Independent being a British newspaper, and I actually kind of used that article at the time as a way of kind of venting about HPPD without necessarily coming out. I could kind of indirectly talk to my friends and family about, this thing, without kind of letting on, I actually have this too. But anyway, so I got involved. I hooked up with, I'm not sure the PRF had actually been founded at that point, but I hooked up with some others in the HPPD community who liked the article. And the foundation, I suppose the two most exciting bits of work we're doing right now, well, the three actually. Well, the first is the documentary you mentioned, and Andrew Callahan from All Gas No Brakes, he is featuring in it. He's got quite an in-depth interview, and funnily enough, he has kind of the precise same experience I and many other HCPD patients have, which is the depersonalization, derealization. And he reveals that what kind of inspired him to do such crazy journalism is essentially like a long-term kind of grounding exercise to get back in his body and get back in the real world, so to speak, because he feels so chronically derealized with his HPPD. But anyway, so you had the documentary, which is going to be called Stuck in a Distorted World. And I think that, so many people with HPPD, it's not necessarily distressing and it kind of just fades into the background of normalcy. But for many people with HPPD, it really is being stuck in a distorted world, especially on the extreme end of these cases, which we document in the documentary. I mean, I spoke to a gentleman the other week in Australia, and his experience, honestly beggars belief how intense his visions are decades on. So the documentary, I think sometime next year, although we've all got full-time jobs, so we're kind of having to fit it between our everyday schedules. But anyway, the other good project we're working on is with Macquarie University in Australia. So there is two sub-projects with this. The first is a questionnaire. So one of the problems with HPPD is that it's kind of so under-researched, and that you really can't make too many generalizations without real caution about it. And so we're using this questionnaire basically to just get a large data set on people's experiences, what triggered them, what were their background factors, what were their personality factors, drug history, etc. because it's only with kind of larger data sets that you can draw any kind of pattern on what might be going on with this condition. And the more exciting element of the Macquarie work is they'll be doing kind of state of the art, kind of never before done neuroimaging on the brains of people with HPPD, because I think that while psychology and the content of people's experiences or trauma, the psychological aspect we can get into later, but I think that there has to be, or we can strongly suspect that there is a neurophysiological element to this condition. And so by looking at the brains of people with HPPD, we can work out, is there a kind of neurological correlate here? What's changed? What are the receptors involved? Is there a particular part of the brain that's being disinhibited? And kind of understanding the mechanism on a neurophysiological level, it kind of lays the conceptual groundwork for some kind of targeted medication. Because right now, if you seek pharmacological treatment for HPPD, and a lot of people do, your options are pretty constrained. You have to kind of use the blunt tools of the psychiatric medication world, which involves a lot of people are prescribed lamotrigine, which is, I believe, a kind of anti-epilepsy medication. And whilst it can be effective for many people, it's kind of laden with side effects. It's not particularly specific. It's a blunt tool. Some people might be prescribed Klonopin or other benzodiazepines, whose primary effect is basically to reduce the anxiety of the condition, because these changes can be so overwhelming and so sudden that it just kind of creates anxiety in itself. And treating the anxiety has the interesting effect that it also lowers the intensity of visuals, which indicates that maybe at the primary or secondary level, these visuals have some kind of correlation with anxiety. And so, as I said, if we can work out the neurophysiological correlations going on with HPPD, maybe it will open up a whole new suite of medications, or even potentially speaking 10, 15, maybe even sooner years down the line, some kind of just pharmacological cure. Because I have an instant suspicion towards pharmacological cure talk, because everything is mind and body. You can't have a purely neurophysiological phenomenon with this kind of thing. And there's going to be a psychological element. But for many people, if they could take a pill that reduces the intensity of their visuals by some enormous percentage, then I think that they'd want to take it. And then the other kind of project we're working on is with University of Melbourne. So some research by John Halpern and Torsten Passi, two psychedelic researchers, suggest that people with HPPD have a higher likelihood than other people, but before they develop the condition, for experiencing various perceptual oddities. So I mentioned at the start of the interview that something like visual snow isn't necessarily abnormal. I've had comments on social media posts I've made saying, I've experienced visual snow and I've never dropped acid. And then it's true. You can have visual snow just as a normal thing. But it seems that people with HPPD, there might be already a kind of visual susceptibility factor at play that's then amplified by drug experiences. And speaking for myself, I think that's probably true looking back. I remember when I was about 13 that I started at nights seeing flashes of purple. It just kind of spontaneously started coming on. And so I can recognize that in myself. And so with Melbourne, they're working on what's called a psychophysics tool, which will basically kind of attempt to create a representation on the screen of the kind of visual warning signs there might be for someone before they take drugs, to work out, are you experiencing phenomena to an unusual level, and could that predispose you to developing more intense changes to your perception if you take drugs. I think that it's not supposed to be an anti-drug weapon. It's not supposed to be, therefore, don't take LSD, don't take psilocybin. It's just, I think at the very least, it gives people a more informed consent for knowing what they get into, because so many people with HPPD, myself included, never even knew it was a thing, or at the very least never knew that they were susceptible it would happen to them, because it's so often it's just kind of dismissed as just rare. Oh, it's real, but it's rare. I mean, in A, we don't even know if it's necessarily that rare, and B, that the fact that it's rare and the fact that it might be a minority experience, that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. And then the other The other project through Melbourne, although this is more tentative, is to do basically a suite of genetic studies to work out, at an even deeper level than neurophysiology, whether there could be a kind of a heritable vulnerability towards the perceptual changes that maybe through some kind of epigenetic mechanism is then amplified by taking psychedelics. So that's all the work we're doing now, really. And then my own kind of awareness raising, media appearance, just trying to create conversation really day to day with my work with them.
I love it. And yeah, it really feels like with this work that you're doing, it's we're on the cusp of some breakthroughs. It's just been so under-researched that there's bound to be some really revelatory insights that emerge from doing the neuroimaging, from just gaining access to a broader scope of individuals. And given that we have the internet and all these kinds of things, I'm very curious what kinds of insights will emerge over the course of the next few years with groups of people intently focusing on this issue. And you're so right, just because it's a minority issue. If it is a minority issue, that doesn't mean we shouldn't attend to it, especially with the ways that psychedelics are being, treated in the media of late, with a lot of fanfare around the successful treatments. There needs to be the conversation around, possible downsides or risk factors for individuals, and it's interesting. I'm someone who's been, involved in the psychedelic space for some time, and there isn't a lot out there on HPPD. There's just relative to a lot of the other things that you can search around about, there isn't a lot of people coming out and talking about it. There isn't a lot of, resource guides or even warnings around the experience. So I'm very excited to see what can emerge here. And it's interesting timing too, because I don't know what is the cause of this, but I checked out the Google Trends before as I was sort of preparing a little bit for this conversation, and HPPD is just, over this past month, has just skyrocketed. It's hit a level it hasn't hit in 5 years, or has never hit really before. It's the highest it's ever been. So it might partly be due to the work that you've been doing. There might be some other factors that are just sort of invisible, but it feels appropriate and good timing that we're sort of seeing this emergence of awareness around this. It feels like the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if there was someone, who is listening to this conversation, is like, wow, I think I have HPPD, and this is what I've been struggling with. And this is, in some ways a relief to know that I have this, but I'm unsure what to do about it. What would your guidance be for them if they were, wanting to seek out some form of support or to better their situation and whatever sort of resources are available for them? How would you advise them? Where would you point them?
I think the first response that just came to my head now is just at a fundamental level, don't panic, because you can have HPPD and live a completely normal life. That's something worth emphasizing. I've had HPPD, or at least the perceptual changes that are grouped under HPPD, for 6 years. And from maybe the first year onwards, life has been normal. Life goes on. And the other thing to mention is that HPPD doesn't have to be a life sentence. I mentioned at the start of earlier in the conversation that as of the last couple of months, just kind of spontaneously, I'm not sure whatever lifestyle changes I've been creating that might have caused this, but it just has kind of noticeably gone down in intensity. And some people, I think that the findings of Dr. Henry Abraham, who kind of originated the condition, in consulting with hundreds of people with HPPD over decades, was that I think half of people, it just kind of spontaneously goes away one day within 5 years. Although that's kind of anecdotal, not really confirmed data, but it's worth keeping in mind. But even that aside, I think the fundamental thing that makes HPPD a problem, if it is a problem for you, it is the anxiety. It's not the perceptual change in and of itself. It's how you engage and respond with it and respond to it. And that can't be a kind of blanket recommendation to just work on the anxiety, work on the depression, or work on the depersonalization you're experiencing, because some people, these perceptual changes are so intense and so florid that it's literally disabling. I know of people who are on kind of disability benefits, welfare, because they can't work or function. But if it isn't at that level, then I'd say just try all the bread and butter techniques that we all know and love for lowering your level of anxiety in your life. Drink plenty of water, have a good diet, exercise, meditate, do yoga. We all know there's good stuff. But in terms of kind of more material specific things for HPPD, I think there's something I've been noticing increasingly is like, don't fixate in everyday life. Like, go for walks, like go into open, wide spaces. Because if you're just shutting yourself in your room and like consciously leaning into your symptoms by kind of just like almost tripping out on various blank surfaces, then that's not going to do anything to reduce the noticeability for HPPD. In fact, you're actually leaning into it. So kind of get out of enclosed environments. And if your HPPD really does really ramp up in dark environments and it's distressing you, maybe get out of dark environments. And I know of someone who sleeps with a light on, because in dark environments it's just too intense for him. And if you want to try medication, then you can try that. That's at your discretion. Because some people, they report real success with things like Klonopin or benzodiazepines or lamotrigine. It can be, although that's something to emphasize, that there hasn't really been any controlled study of what works. The evidence base is literally just kind of handfuls of case reports. I think that apart from one study that involved interviews of 25 people, but the largest case report ever with HPPD with any kind of medication was about a dozen. So we just don't really know if medication works for sure, but if you want to give that a go, give it a go. And there are psychiatrists out there who know what HPPD is, and you can find them fairly easily online. And another piece of advice, which I would attach some caution to this, is to get involved in the HPPD community online. I think the most active one right now is the HPPD subreddit, where a lot of posts are made, basically just people when they first get it and they're like, shit, what's happening to me? What should I do? And then the community there is so supportive and it's quite engaged. But I'd say don't fixate on the forums, because there's a tendency to kind of create this like private, kind of almost cargo cult sort of vibe on the forums, where people just kind of collectively fixate on their symptoms in a way that isn't necessarily good for them. So I think there's something of a kind of tapering effect, where initially the forums are very useful for making you feel like you're not alone, venting, especially if you can't talk to friends and family about it in real life. But I'd caution staying on there for too long. So maybe, almost like a drug, taper your engagement with these forums. And then if you want to contribute to the evidence base around HPPD, I'd say try and at least subscribe, or try and at least engage with the questionnaires that are being run through Macquarie. I think a questionnaire is coming out through Johns Hopkins as well, in affiliation with another HPPD nonprofit called the Neurosensory Research Foundation, which is older and it's also active. So just kind of hang in there and try not to be overwhelmed. That's what I'd say.
I love there's a lot of rich sort of offerings in that last piece there, Ed, and I think that someone who's listening to this who might be struggling, there's a lot of good sort of pointers and suggestions, and there's a lot of really interesting things you can generalize from that as well, that feel just sort of just wisdom in general. Like if you're suffering with something and then you find a group where you don't feel so alone, and that you run the risk of sort of building your identity around this form of suffering, and then you almost can't let it go without losing a part of your identity. Then you feel like you're committed and obligated to sort of maintain the symptoms or the experiences that you're having, because it's such a deep community that you're a part of. And so I think that tapering, rather than just saying, join the community, I think that's shrewd advice, because you don't want to sort of over align yourself or over sort of commit yourself to just being a person with HPPD. I think that's a really interesting point. And the other piece around panic and anxiety, I mean, there's a lot of people who have probably experienced this inside of their own psychedelic trips, where if you are having some intensity and you start to panic around that intensity, the intensity becomes more intense, right? It's sort of this feedback loop where it becomes sort of reinforced. And so I love the suggestions of just finding space to, reduce the stress and also not make things so salient, right? Like you mentioned, sitting in your room and just focusing in on, the distortion that you're experiencing. I think about, I'm a magician. I've been doing magic for years and years, and I use cards more than most normal people would. This has afforded me a sort of like sensitivity to playing cards. So I can pick up a deck. I can tell if someone had just recently touched the deck. I can tell if it's short a few cards, if it has more cards. Like there's certain intricacies and subtleties that I'm tuned into because of the amount of sort of fixation that I've had on a deck of playing cards. I bring that up as an analogy for almost like the ways that our brains can start to draw in, and our attention can make details and things more salient than other details. We live in there's so many details to be perceived in an environment. So this point around fixation, it may be that sort of, the more one fixates, the more that the symptoms sort of, kind of emerge or become clear and all this kind of stuff. Of course, I'm doing a lot of just sort of pontificating, but it would make sense to me that if someone is overly fixating on these things, it diminishes their ability for the symptoms to subside. So yeah, I love a lot of what you've been sharing here. I'm curious if what I've just communicated, if that resonates, if it sounds like I'm
yeah, it does. And I especially like the phrase salience, because as someone who's kind of into the work of John Vervaeke, I've come across, I think salience is a great way of describing the kind of phenomenology of being a human being, and also HPPD. And something I actually forgot to mention is a common question in the HPPD world is, can I continue to use drugs? And for some people, it's actually something of one of the major costs of HPPD is that they've had maybe several quite meaningful psychedelic experiences, and then the idea that they can never do it again can actually be quite sad and quite gutting. And for me, it was, when I first experienced HPPD, I had four acid trips, at least half of which were pretty awesome. So I was like, never going to have to trip again. But my experience is that, so I basically took 18 months of all psychedelics. I was staying well clear. And I did have a few cannabis experiences, and maybe a year after I first developed these changes. And I'd say, if you just started experiencing HPPD and you're really worried, just stay away from drugs. Like even try and stay away from caffeine, any kind of psychoactive, because everyone's experience with HPPD is going to be really sensitive to everyone's subjective neurophysiology and psychology. And I don't want to speak for everyone, but just to play it safe, I'd stay away from drugs. But if you really do continue feeling the call for psychedelics, then I wouldn't necessarily stay away forever, because I didn't, I had, as I mentioned, I'd had 4 acid trips when I was 17, and as well as possibly predisposing me towards HPPD, it also meant that my experiences I barely even scratched the surface of what psychedelia could be. So when I got to university and when I was 19, 20, I had several other psychedelic experiences which didn't amplify my HPPD, at least at the baseline level. Maybe there might have been temporary periods of days or a couple of weeks where it was higher than usual, maybe in the kind of afterglow of a psychedelic experience, but baseline, it never affected it. And these psychedelic experiences have been, immensely meaningful. And I couldn't even imagine, based on my 17-year-old trips, just how life-changing and how potentially positive a drug like LSD could actually be if you work with it. And so, if you really feel like there's more to explore with psychedelics, as I said, approach with caution, but don't feel like you have to close the door forever. And, but at the same time, even if you continue feeling the call, I have probably made it more remote, the possibility that these perceptual changes will ever, go away, so to speak. I don't know, and you can't speak with any certainty, but I think that there's some reason to suspect that, through my subsequent psychedelic experiences, I kind of made it harder for my visual cortex to renormalize, so to speak. But I think another thing to kind of mention is that is to kind of lean into the neurodiversity side of things. But by which I mean, the fact that you see the world in a different way, it doesn't mean it's necessarily worse. That doesn't mean it's bad. It's just different. And part of why we love psychedelics in the right context, of course, is precisely because they change the way you look at the world. And I think something we're going to have to increasingly realize, and maybe our work around HPPD will make us realize this more, is that maybe the changes brought about by psychedelics aren't just cognitive, aren't just about your beliefs, isn't just about your relationship with yourself. It's also possibly what you see. And maybe visual changes is just maybe part of the package that you have to accept if psychedelics have changed you. And they don't have to be bad. I mean, there is a subreddit called HPPD Positivity where people, they kind of lean in to their HPPD symptoms, so to speak. Like they wouldn't even recognize them as symptoms because symptoms implies a kind of medical model approach where, they just think, I mean, a common way to look at it is, this is a free trip. And I've heard at least one psychiatrist kind of marginalize or dismiss people who frame HPPD as just a free trip as being, just sort of druggy idiots. But who's to judge them? Like my HPPD, it's hard to know what is and isn't HPPD, but I feel like I'm more able to enter a state of mind that's at least borders on psychedelic because of this thing I have, so to speak, where, I feel like before I ever started touching psychedelics or developing HPPD, like music especially, I feel like there'll be moments when I'm listening to a song where it almost kind of, the intensity and beauty of the music, it almost correlates with the other changes of HPPD. And so it doesn't have to be bad. Like maybe that's another piece of advice I'll throw in there, although obviously to approach it with caution, but you can frame it however you like, really.
Yeah, this raises a really interesting point around the ways that we deal with things, and if we overly sort of structure it as a pathology, then that basically creates an emotional reaction up against that sort of pathological framing that makes us feel bad and makes us feel broken or whatever it may be. But that doesn't need to be the frame as you're putting it out there. I mean, this is actually, it's very interesting. It's, there's so much that we don't understand about the brain and consciousness. And so to just assume off the bat that that is bad. I mean, of course, in the cases where it feels debilitating, this is, we're not applauding that and not saying you should actively go out and seek this superpower necessarily. But I think it is a worthy investigation of tuning into the ways in which this shift is supportive in certain ways, or it lends certain experiences to you that otherwise might be more difficult to access. That I think is a healthy way of relating to any sort of change. I mean, even going through tragedy, or I think about the times in my life where I've been deeply grieved by a loss, and that loss can popularly be framed as a negative, as a bad thing. When you fully experience it and allow yourself that experience, it can become, extremely beautiful, and it contextualizes the whole of your life in new terms that you wouldn't have been able to experience if you stayed locked in this loss is bad sort of mentality. And so there's something similar or sort of shared in really embracing whatever our circumstances might be. And there's probably some stoicism in that as well. So yeah, I find this all very very fascinating, and it makes me wonder, what is, it gets down to some really deep questions, around perception itself, and why, do we know what you're seeing isn't there? Like, I mean, I'm curious what people like. There's probably some far-flung theories of, oh, you're perceiving auras or whatever it might be. I mean, there's a really sort of, it invites really interesting questions and takes us up to the limit against what is consciousness and what is actually happening in the brain. And so I'm curious if, I don't have a particular question around this sort of riff or musing, but I'm curious if that activates anything in you, or there's anything that you sort of see in what I've just shared that's worth responding to.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that something that I think a potential phenomenon that HPPD is kind of like pointing to that we never really realized was the relationship between anxiety and vision. Because HPPD, like, it's entirely possible that the more we research this condition, the more we understand it, like this, it could be that at least for some portion of people, like this is entirely a phenomenon of maybe like post-psychedelic anxiety. Because I've heard of, or even in some cases, trauma. Because, people who've never taken any drug, just as a symptom of a generalized anxiety disorder, report, literally identical perceptual changes. Although maybe people who have reported these changes after psychedelics, like maybe their visual changes are more of a psychedelic hallucinogenic flavor, although we don't really know for sure. But the halos, the after images, even in some cases geometric patterns, people with anxiety report this. And I think that even in cases of PTSD, people can report visual changes. And so we really know nothing, or at least very little, about the role of vision. And Andrew Huberman, I believe it was at Stanford, he's doing really interesting stuff about just how all-encompassing and how huge, your visual experiences, in terms of just, your own subjective phenomenology and your relationship with the world. Vision, I think we can forget how huge it is. And I think that perception is an interesting one. Like, why is it that, why does it seem to trigger us in a particular way, that the idea that other people see the world differently to us? Like, we can entirely accept that other people can, although maybe not so much these days, we can accept that other people have different points of view or different beliefs to us. So what's so different about perception? Or what's so different about, well, everyone has their own inner voice. And, increasingly in like the critical psychiatry world, there's a recognition that hearing voices doesn't have to be bad or doesn't have to be pathological. But I'm not sure that's necessarily, I'm not sure that like neurodiversity angle has like crossed into visual perception yet. But I don't see a reason why not. But in my own thinking about, why do we have this special relationship with perception, is I think that perception, visual perception, it's more public. Right. So if it's, whilst your thoughts are more directly interior, like it's more your own private sphere, the idea that, maybe the world we're sharing, we could all be seeing it differently. I think that it kind of cuts at the deep code of our relationships. Even I was talking to a researcher about this the other day. Maybe it even points at a fundamental level to, to politics possibly, because, if you go into the deep political philosophy world, there'll be the separation of the private and the public sphere, the recognition that when people come into groups, when they come into collectives, that this is the realm of politics, that the polis. And so the idea that kind of in that move from the private to the public, that there's the assumption of the shared space. But if in this shared space, even at the fundamental level, we're literally seeing different things, I think that raises interesting questions. But kind of a pet theory that I've been entertaining, which I alluded to earlier with my mention of trauma, well, I think that in some cases, HPPD might be, although this is highly speculative, that's partly what makes HPPD interesting, is that there's so much room for speculation, is that it could be almost like an expression of stored trauma. And I think that there are a few reasons to believe this could be the case. Like, the first is just like the basic trend we see right now, just an increasing recognition that trauma is like a highly embodied phenomenon. Like, we all know our Gabor Mate, our Van der Kolk, the one the body keeps the score. And so the idea, the right side of history with this kind of stuff is to view things in a holistic way. And so the idea that visual perception is thrown in there as something that can be affected by trauma, it isn't out of the realms of possibility. And The second thing is that it seems, based on the work of John Halpern and Torsten Passi, who I mentioned earlier, they found in their interviews with HPPD patients that there was a particularly high correlation between your likelihood of developing these changes and challenging, if not traumatic, psychedelic experience. And when I think about my own experience with the condition, kind of the fourth trip that set it in motion, like the actual trip itself was pretty terrible. And then like my re-entry into the world was also terrible. So I feel like the kind of neuroplastic phase of returning to the real world, so to speak, I suspect we'll learn that that's crucial for for developing HPPD, like in your transition into the normal state of consciousness. And if that's buckled in some way, if your re-entry is, fucked up, then there's a strong chance, there's a stronger than normal chance you'll get HPPD. But so John Halpern and Torsten Passi's work, and then the third signal here is the work of Stan Grof, who did actually cover HPPD in his writings. I think it's just maybe one line in a book he did called LSD and Psychotherapy, maybe from the 70s or 80s, and he describes patients he had who describe, the exact phenomena that I was describing, the after images, the halos, and for Grof, that was a sign that they'd sort of release the valves of the unconscious with the psychedelic drugs, and the HPPD was an expression of almost unintegrated or kind of dissociated material from the psychedelic experience, from the unconscious. And Grof's solution to these people was actually, rather than treating it as a pathology, as to kind of treat it as a sign of a need for further integration. And so he with these patients, he actually gave them more psychedelics, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend for people just kind of doing a DIY. But he noticed that these people's perceptual changes, they just resolved when they had subsequent kind of liberating or healing psychedelic experiences. And, Grof might, I'm not sure he wrote about this, but I'm sure he might recommend, as an alternative to more LSD, he might recommend holotropic breath work, but he was behind. So that's something I'm curious about trying myself, is that, less than interpreting HPPD as a positive thing, because you don't want to force toxic positivity in there. You don't want to just, your framing can't just be a purely cerebral thing. It has to actually come from somewhere that's meaningful, and you don't want to pretend it's positive when it isn't. So less than that, you could at least interpret your HPPD as a sign, possibly, that there's material to be explored there in relation to your psychedelic experiences. What was it about that trip that was different? What happened? You can use it as like a kind of autobiographical, introspective exercise in that respect. But the thing with HPPD is you have to draw a line and say this can't apply to everyone, because you can get these exact perceptual changes, it seems, through fairly I think even from completely, as well as from non-psychedelic drugs, you can get it from, you can get it basically from drugs that we don't ordinarily take to be psychoactive. So I've heard of reports of people getting after antibiotics. You can get it from SSRIs. I've read case reports of people getting after risperidone, the antipsychotic. And we wouldn't necessarily consider those to be, the antibiotics in particular, we wouldn't necessarily say that those were psychoactive. But so I think that maybe the sense I get is that drugs of all kinds, any kind of acceleration on the nervous system can trigger these changes. But it seems that psychedelics in particular, and LSD in particular, seems to be like a very potent cause of this.
Yeah, this makes me, it's interesting because there are some questions that arise, and then you get there before I even have a chance of asking them. And that was related to if HPPD, if there was a higher prevalence on the heels of very difficult psychedelic experience. And it makes me want to spend a little bit of time with you discussing what are things people can do to support a more positive, or just like hold a better space for a psychedelic experience. But before we get there, I'm curious about something related to if this is associated with any transformation in thoughts that people report as well, because we've talked a lot about sort of the visual field and these kinds of impacts and the anxiety that can emerge or interface with the sort of visual transformations. Do people report shifts in their thinking that often comes coupled with HPPD? I'm curious about this because you can, obviously people will take psychedelics to have some kind of breakthrough in the way that they are relating to themselves, often around, emotional expression or release, and changing the sort of monologue inside of their head to be one that is less, brutish and a bit more compassionate and all of these kinds of things. So I'm just curious if there's been any indication that HPPD often comes along with certain styles of thinking.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, so some people do report cognitive changes. I mentioned earlier the kind of dissociative response, although I'll bracket that for now. It's really, I think that here you get to the kind of borders of where language can take you, because I've spoken to people who kind of report that their thinking processes can become almost psychedelicized. I've heard people describe, I just get trippy thoughts now. Like my thoughts are completely non-linear. They're completely scattered. Like people describe thoughts going forwards and backwards and just basically being completely chaotic. I've heard reports of people's thinking process almost becoming kind of quasi-dyslexic. And there's no reason why this wouldn't be the case, at least for some people, because, as I was mentioning earlier, everything is interconnected at this level. And so the idea that, the perceptual, the visual change is just a symptom of a broader nervous system change that also expresses in cognitive change is entirely plausible to me. Although, working out whether underlying the visual change and the cognitive change is broader anxiety or like a broader traumatic imprint, I think that's something really to explore. But I mean, in my own experience, it's really hard to separate. I've definitely become weirder since taking psychedelics, but whether that's because of HPPD, it's difficult to know. There's the common trope of like the burnout, the acid casualty. There's the story of you'll meet someone at a Grateful Dead concert and they're kind of just like a bit dead and they can't really talk properly. And like, obviously this trope is just a trope, but I think that there's something to explore there about people whose thinking process just in some way have been debilitated. And I wonder whether, as the more we research and understand HPPD, we'll understand different flavors of it. Like, this isn't just, persisting perception disorder. This is post-psychedelic change. And that can be positive, it can be negative. Like the therapeutic benefits, that is post-psychedelic change. And I'm not sure that the automatic assumption that visual changes are a side effect to be, reported and carefully monitored, or as, model as an adverse reaction. I think that it has to be, maybe that the move should be to be more value neutral about all kinds of changes. And actually, something I forgot to mention is that as of this morning, I will be pursuing a master's degree in psychology to do research into HPPD, which is being funded by the Perception Restoration Foundation, which is exciting. And these are precisely the kind of questions I want to explore, particularly, the intersection of HPPD and anxiety, and trying to understand whether people report different flavors of HPPD, maybe according to the drug of choice. Yeah, all sorts of questions to be explored.
Yeah, that's very exciting. You'll be, I'm sure as you having the experience that you have already in doing this work, as you encounter, different theories and, as you're going through the process of educating yourself, there's going to be lots of real kinds of insights that emerge and different possibilities and pathways for further research and all of that kind of stuff. But it makes, part of what you were sharing there, the changes that people experience. And I was thinking about, there's this famous, I don't know how famous it is, but it's famous, at least for me. There's a chart that measures, who was it? The Theckley Foundation or something like that shows a brain some kind of network, pre-psilocybin and then post-psilocybin, and it's meant to show like the relaxing of the default mode network inside of, a psilocybin experience. And it makes me feel like psychedelics make things more fluid in a way. And you even see this back when Timothy Leary was writing about the 8th circuit brain and this kind of stuff, where there's an imprinting that can happen inside of psychedelics where it almost makes the brain more sort of susceptible to prominent changes, almost like a solid structure becomes more fluid. And so it makes me feel like there's inside of a psychedelic experience, there's a deconstruction and then a reconstruction that happens. And sometimes that reconstruction is suboptimal, and sometimes it can be optimal. It can be therapeutic and, done in the right kinds of settings. Of course, this is just my sort of folk scientist sort of sitting on the sidelines explanations of things, and the mechanisms might not actually be as I'm describing, but it would make sense if that is sort of the way that it goes. And I guess with that being said, I am curious, given the information that you've been exposed to, the practices that you've applied in your life, the individuals that you've spoken to, are there a set of, there's classics, that people suggest in terms of making a psychedelic experience as safe as possible. Maybe safe isn't the right word, but well held, perhaps that's the word. Are there tips or input that you have around, how people can sort of do their due diligence around having an appropriately structured psychedelic experience?
Well, yeah. I think that there's a tendency in the community to be great at giving advice, well, not necessarily taking it. But as someone who has had a number of psychedelic experiences, I suppose you have to take everything with kind of qualifiers, but I'd honestly say at least to teenagers, just don't take psychedelics. Like, you're too young. Although I kind of feel like I bypassed maybe a lot of bullshit bad narratives and bad patterns I might have fallen into that I avoided with psychedelics. But I think that we don't know enough about how psychedelics change you to start dabbling with that stuff whilst your ego structure is still developing. But anyway, in terms of holding a safe psychedelic experience in a moment, I'd say just the one classic advice is just, you have the trip sitter. I don't want to present myself as an expert, but at least something that I realized in my last psychedelic experience, which was on LSD, was just the sense that it's not just that your set and setting is a kind of, it really is a moment by moment experience, and that moment by moment the psychedelic experience is what you make of it. Like, you can find that an hour's gone by and you haven't really, and you could spend an hour where you're just basically having a great time, like just kind of staring at the carpet. And I feel like just try and make the most of it. Try and go into it with an intention, but also don't necessarily go into it with too many strong frames. I mean, I remember on that last psychedelic experience, which wasn't in a particularly controlled environment, but even there, I noticed how the sort of dominant mental health narrative was making its way into my trip, and not necessarily in the most productive way. And I noticed this kind of in the week or two after the experience, was that I kind of had a hard time putting myself back together with that kind of mental health angle in the background, which was, anytime I experience any kind of negative emotion, I kind of felt to myself, I just had this thing that's being sold to us as an amazing therapy tool, and I still feel this negative emotion. So I think that, every frame has its pros and cons. And I think that the mental health frame that kind of psychedelics are using, that the psychedelic culture is using for legitimacy these days, has a kind of real shadow side, which means you might want to approach it with caution. But, in terms of the safe space of psychedelic experience, I suppose just like, all the basics. I'm not sure I have particular insight to add.
Yeah, I think that there's probably two broad categories to look into, and that is setting up your circumstance in a way that isn't going to be, you're around people that you trust more or less.
Yeah,
I worry, I didn't start experimenting with psychedelics until I was, well past my teenage years. And I do have concern when, people are going to large concert venues and, taking these substances around all kinds of strangers. And, it's like, I sound like an old man, saying this kind of stuff, probably to some of the younger people who might be listening to it. But, I feel like what is never bad advice is to treat these substances with reverence. There's a lot that we don't understand, and we're engaging in, really, transformative, possibilities, and that those transformative possibilities aren't always necessarily positive. So I think having that kind of respect for them and not just treating them as sort of, like a recreational free for all is probably a good disposition to have most of the time. And then there's also like real important internal sort of self-regulation skills. I feel like that are useful around, what's I think being able to accept one's experience is a really important sort of I don't want to say hack that I feel like makes it sort of kind of just cheapens it a little bit. But if you are experiencing, and this is true, I think across the board, the thing is psychedelics just really intensify the feedback loop. Whatever you're going through, if you can find a place of acceptance for that thing that you're experiencing, then the resistance and the intensity can become a bit more manageable. I find that the more we resist things, that they can just dramatically increase the tension and intensity that we're experiencing inside the psychedelic space and outside of it. So being able to have that, cultivate that sort of internal skill set is really important. And that's another reason that when you're young, I mean, I think Andrew said he was 13 when he started experimenting, which is so young. It's just so young. And we don't know enough about this stuff to, I think, to ever encourage that. So, with that said, I mean, we've spent this conversation talking about the world of psychedelics and HPPD and, as an outcrop of that and the ways that can affect people. But I'm curious because the domain of psychedelics is one of intrigue for a lot of people because of the promise of transformation and expansion and all of these kinds of things. And it makes me curious to ask you if there are other tools, other, venues in which you've explored and experimented to seek, personal betterment or whatever sort of phrase you might want to use that you found really, really beneficial that you'd want to, speak to or share.
Yeah. I suppose like a lot of people in the psychedelic world, my initial psychedelic experiences led to or kind of produced an interest in meditation. And I'm really far from an expert, or I'm far from being an adept meditator, but maybe it's my age, maybe it's the way I approach psychedelics, but I feel like in terms of really creating the kind of behavioral changes that produce betterment in day-to-day life, meditation has been a more useful tool than psychedelics. Psychedelics, they're two ingredients that go usefully together, because I feel like meditation, whilst it's good for kind of meat and potatoes, bread and butter of leading a mindful, attentive, present life, you really have to give it years of focus in order to even just get anywhere approaching the kind of peak accelerating experiences that you can access through psychedelics. But that said, with meditation has been pretty huge. But I suppose also just like general reading around spirituality. You can never be too cognitively fixated or too cerebral with this stuff. Like, you have to live it, you have to embody it. But I feel like, especially in the wake of psychedelic experiences, engaging with material from Buddhism, Jungian psychology, even Christianity. I had a particular psilocybin trip that felt weirdly Christian, and in the last 3 years, I've really kind of explored the lessons of Jesus. And I don't want to sound too nutty, but he really does have some great things to say. And I think Buddhism is particularly interesting, and as kind of John Vervaeke and the University of Toronto team are working on, there's just a huge overlap between Buddhism and the lessons of modern cognitive science, and also kind of outside the spiritual world. I think that I found huge benefit in creative pursuits. So I've been a guitar player for approaching 7 years, and I think that little things like playing guitar or the piano, or even just listening to music, I think these are things that we're going to have to start valuing. I think we're at risk of forgetting how useful these things are in our digital, disembodied world, and almost in an attention economy that profits from having your eyeball on screen. Every second you're on it, and its every incentive is to keep you engaged. I kind of resonate with the idea that playing guitar, playing piano, deep listening to music is almost like an act of resistance to the strange digital future we're heading in, which I really do think is kind of looking more dystopian by the day, especially with that metaverse announcement. That freaked me out. So yeah, that's kind of what I like doing.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, there's so much there, especially related to the metaverse stuff. And I've been gathering my thoughts around that whole sort of domain, because it really feels like in a lot of ways we're already deeply embedded in what one might call the metaverse, just not to the level of immersion that I think is being anticipated. And I agree that there is something lost, in this march towards progress or convenience. And I was speaking with some friends about this notion that I've had for some time around what is lost. When I think about these, the experience that, past generations would have had when the album was such a thing. It was so central. You'd go to your record store and you'd come home and you'd place it down first you'd have the experience of opening it up and looking through the cover art, and it was a very tactile experience. And then you place it down and put the needle and have you'd sit down and listen to the whole album probably. And today, because of the convenience that we have, which is still very cool, it's nice to have all the world's music at my fingertips. But there is something that gets lost, some sort of preciousness is the way that I describe it, that comes from having everything all the time at our fingertips, that doesn't allow us to sort of savor and experience things in the way that that perhaps we did in the past, because you always have the option of changing it. There's always this sort of endless shifting that you can do. And that, I think, might cause a sense of restlessness or even sort of just existential FOMO. There's always something else I could be looking at or interacting with other than what I'm doing. And that was less so. We didn't have these information floodgates just pouring into our ears and eyes as much as was the case in the past. So lots of interesting things, and hopefully there's some sort of counter movement or some degree of interest that emerges in having experiences that are non-digital. Like we see these retreats that people will go on, but that maybe picking up habits of unplugging from all digital devices for a day, a week, or I'm curious if we'll see something like that begin to emerge in opposition to the further sort of nudge towards deeper and deeper immersion in the digital world. But that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I think that kind of to circle back to our conversation, I really am worried about how the psychedelic moment we're in is intersecting with this digitization, because at a basic level, let's think about the belief changes that can happen under the influence after psychedelics. Like for at least a week after a psychedelic experience, you're especially suggestible. And this is a point that's been made by Eric Davis, which is that the hyper-personalized filter bubble forming effects of social media and search algorithms mean that people, I think more than ever, if they start engaging with psychedelics is they can get lost. And like, just look at the absolute infiltration of the psychedelic or new age world with some, wrong-headed skepticism towards vaccines or concerns about 5G, the QAnon shaman, that kind of level. But even at a less florid level, I feel like my ability to integrate after my last psychedelic experience, which is in September, compared to even like 3 years ago when I was doing most of my use with LSD, I feel like I was so much more scattered, given how I think in the 3 years since there's really been even more of an upsurge towards the attention economy. So I do really worry about that, and kind of the fact that so much of the psychedelic moment is being driven by positive PR through kind of the 24-hour news cycle, which is like heavily married to the attention economy. Like it's all part of the same media circuit. And then throw in something like the metaverse. Like I feel like the psychedelic state, part of its promise is finally some kind of mental space away from surveillance capitalism, away from the digital. But with the metaverse, like, which is probably going to be awesome. That's the problem with it. It's going to be so fun, at least on a short-term kind of limbic hijacking level, that I think we're going to be generationally, culturally hooked on that stuff. And I feel like psychedelics, if they have some kind of activist power, it might be more and more to just at least serve as some kind of button to push to finally just escape that world, finally have a view from outside. But I worry if that space is being dissolved more and more.
That is a very interesting line of thought. And as I was speaking before about the ways that imprinting can happen, this sort of vulnerability after a psychedelic experience, and then being, placed in front of these very tailored sort of floodgates of information, to like, that's sort of the influencing factor. That is what is impressing upon someone in that sort of vulnerable state. It makes me feel concerned. I haven't sort of connected those dots before. And yeah, I think there's really something to sort of be mindful about in the sort of days and weeks after a psychedelic experience, to have really good hygiene, like there's, we have to understand the economics of 24-hour news and clickbait headlines and all of these things. And none of these things are like, this isn't there to inform us. Their primary aim isn't to inform us. The primary aim is to generate revenue. And they do that through really sort of, common enemy coordination and contentious, headlines and all these kinds of things. And this also brings up I think it's been discussed more, but it's just the really kind of clarifying for people that psychedelics aren't necessarily going to produce spiritual advancement in any way. There are individuals who will take psychedelics and they may even experience ego dissolution or something akin to that, and then come out of it imagining as if they have grown in some profound way, where the ego then just begins to possess that experience and wear it as if it were some badges of spiritual furthering. And so there are ways that sort of narcissism can be amplified and inflamed by the use of psychedelics, and this is something to be aware of as well. And I think that there may be a relationship to that dynamic and the sort of ways that people get hooked into the social media sort of space, where the conviction that they feel for their perspectives is outsized. They should have a bit more humility around what it is that they're experiencing. But again, the way the information is framed comes at them in a way that they feel like they can hold that kind of confidence. And there aren't a lot of people who are capable of standing outside the stream and really understanding how their filter bubble is shaping, their reality and their perception of the world. And so, yeah.
I mean, and almost to take it a step further, like, if there is something about the way our economy and our social structure is moving that's destroying our ability to integrate after psychedelic experiences, then if we take seriously the idea that HPPD might be an expression of unintegrated psychedelic experience, maybe you could draw a link there that as more and more people take psychedelics and struggle to integrate nowadays, could there be a spike in HPPD sort of cases, especially distressing kinds, driven by that? I feel like that the dominoes could fall in that way. And you mentioned that the narcissism aspect with psychedelics, and kind of to bring that back to the HPPD case again, I feel like in my case, taking psychedelics so young, one of its costs, as well as maybe making me more predisposed to developing these perceptual changes, was that it created quite a hook to wrap an identity around at that age, when your ego structure, as I mentioned, is still developing and vulnerable. And certainly when I was like 19, 20, there was definitely an element of psychedelic narcissism at play. And I think that there's definitely been studies of meditators and they're actually at a higher likelihood of being narcissists, it wouldn't surprise me at all if people who took psychedelics were more likely to be narcissists. And if it's true, I think that is, it's a good headline for like the kind of right-leaning press to publish, but it's also is true. And I think that it's kind of devastating for the psychedelic case that, if anything, it actually can swell your ego a bit.
Yeah, and it's just a good reminder that these tools are tools, and they're not a panacea. They're not going to just by ingesting the magic pill will make your life worlds better. There's more to it than that, and yeah, it also makes me consider the sort of metaverse inquiry and the social media feeds. You brought up derealization and depersonalization earlier, and the sort of broad this sense of them being in the matrix and that kind of stuff, and simulation theory. And I just wonder if there's going to be some correlates or parallels there, where people see just how virtualized our lives have become, and how much what we experience and what we're interacting with isn't strictly speaking real, but just distortions based on incentive structures of institutions that are scrambling to survive, and then how that can feel like, oh my whole world's a lie, or whatever it may be. It makes me wonder if that kind of stuff will emerge. But I'm curious, Ed. We'll add some links in the show notes so people can do the sort of questionnaire and stuff like that. Where is it that people can continue to sort of engage with you if they want to learn more about the stuff that's happening with the Perception Restoration Foundation, as well as as you continue to publish more work, and as you pursue your degree and things of that nature? How is it that people can continue to engage and interact with you online?
Awesome. I'm trying to stay off it as much as I can, but my most active interface with the world, so to speak, is probably my Twitter page, where I hope in the next couple of weeks, though maybe not when this recording is published, I will be posting an article on HPPD, in which I'll kind of maybe assemble a lot of the thoughts I've shared here today, for a publication called Mad in America. So if you find this, if you found this interesting, I think you'll enjoy that article. In terms of HPPD stuff, the PRF the Perception Restoration Foundation website would be most instructive. Like, there's quite an in-depth FAQ section, and we're also working on an information booklet, which will kind of give the sort of TLDR of all the literature around HPPD and all the unanswered questions. I think that will be published on the PRF website in not too long. But in terms of regular updates from them, although there's a newsletter whose first edition is fairly imminent, so you can go onto the PRF website and register your email address there. And otherwise, you can check out my portfolio to kind of see my archive of pieces, which has a few psychedelic pieces, but also lots of other stuff from history, music, psychology, and the URL for my portfolio is just in my Twitter.
Great. Well, we'll get all those links in the show notes as well, so people can have easy access. But Ed, I really appreciate you coming on the show. I think this is a really important subject to discuss. I appreciate your willingness to be open about your own experience, and I'm very excited to see what will emerge, in the months and years ahead as more formalized research is being done on HPPD. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, mate. Cheers.